reading What is Cinema, Volume 2 by Andre Bazin, The Evolution of the Western. By the eve of the war, the Western had reached a definitive stage of perfection. The year 1940 marks a point beyond which some new development seemed inevitable, a development that the 4 years of war delayed, then modified, though without controlling it. Stagecoach, 1939, is the ideal example of the maturity of a style brought to classic perfection. John Ford struck the ideal balance between social myth, historical reconstruction, psychological truth, and the traditional theme of the Western mise-en-scène. None of these elements dominated any other. Stagecoach is like a wheel, so perfectly made that it remains in equilibrium on its axis in any position. Let us list some names and titles for 1939 through 1940. King Vidor, Northwest Passage, 1940. Michael Curtis, The Santa Fe Trail, 1940. Virginia City, 1940. Fritz Lang, The Return of Frank James, 1940. The Western Union, 1940. John Ford, Drums Along the Mohawk, 1939. William Wyler, The Western, 1940. George Marshall, Destry Rides Again, with Marlene Dietrich, 1939. Note: a disappointing remake of this film was shot in 1955 by the same George Marshall with Audie Murphy. End of note. This list is significant. It shows that the established directors, having perhaps begun their careers 20 years before with serial westerns made almost anonymously, turn or return to the Western at the peak of their careers. Even Wyler, whose gift seemed to be for anything but this genre. This phenomenon can be explained by the widespread publicity given Westerns between 1937 and 1940. Perhaps the sense of national awareness which preceded the war in the Roosevelt era contributed to this. We are disposed to think so insofar as the Western is rooted in the history of the American nation which it exalts directly or indirectly. In any case, this period supports J.L. Ryu-Peyrut's argument for the historical realism of the Western. Note: La Western ou le cinéma américain par excellence, collection, Septième Art, Editions du Cerf, Paris, 1953. End of note. But, by paradox more apparent than real, the war years, properly so-called, almost removed the Western from Hollywood's repertoire. On reflection, this is not surprising, for the same reason that the Westerns were multiplied and admired at the expense of other adventure films. The war film was to exclude them, at least provisionally, from the market. As soon as the war seemed virtually won, and even before peace was definitely established, the Western reappeared and was again made in large numbers. But this new phase of its history deserves a closer look. The perfection or the classic stage which the genre had reached implied that it had to justify its survival by introducing new elements. I do not pretend to explain everything by the famous law of successive aesthetic periods, but there is no rule against bringing it into play here. Take the new films of John Ford, My Darling Clementine, 1946, and Fort Apache, 1948, could well be examples of Baroque embellishment of the classicism of Stagecoach. All the same, although this concept of the Baroque may account for a certain technical formalism or for the relative preciousness of this or that scenario, I do not feel that it can justify any further complex evolution. This evolution must be explained doubly, or this evolution must be explained doubtless in relation to the level of perfection reached in 1940, but also in terms of the events of 1941 to 1945. Let us call the ensemble of forms adopted by the post-war Western the super Western. For the purposes of our expose, this word will bring together phenomena that are not always comparable. It can certainly be justified on negative grounds, in contrast to the classicism of the 40s and to the tradition of which it is the outcome. The super Western is a Western that would be ashamed to be just itself and looks for some additional interest to justify its existence in aesthetic, sociological, moral, psychological, political, or erotic interest. In short, some quality extrinsic to the genre and which is supposed to enrich it. We will come back later to these adjectives, but first we should indicate the influence of the war on the evolution of the Western after 1944. The phenomenon of the super Western would probably have emerged anyway, but its content would have been different. The real influence of the war made itself deeply felt when it was over. The major films inspired by it come naturally after 1945. But the world conflict not only provided Hollywood with spectacular scenes, it also provided, and indeed forced upon it, some subjects to reflect upon, at least for a few years. History, which was formerly only the material of the Western, will often become its subject. This is particularly true of Fort Apache, in which we see the beginning of a political rehabilitation of the Indian, which was followed up by numerous Westerns to Bronco Apache and exemplified particularly in Broken Arrow by Delmer Davies. (1950). But the profounder influence of the war is undoubtedly more indirect, and one must look to find it whenever the film substitutes a social or moral theme for the traditional one. The origin of this goes back to 1943 with William Wellman's Oxbow incident, of which high noon is the distant relation. However, in Zinman's film, it is also a rampant McCarthyism that is under scrutiny. Eroticism also may be seen to be at least an indirect consequence of the war, so far as it derives from the triumph of the pinup girl. This is true perhaps of Howard Hughes's The Outlaw, 1943. Love is to all intents and purposes foreign to the Western. Shane will rightly exploit this conflict, and eroticism all the more so, its appearance as a dramatic springboard, implying that henceforth the genre is just being used as a foil, the better to set off the sex appeal of the heroine. There is no doubt about what is intended in Duel in the Sun, King Vidor, 1946, whose spectacular luxury provides a further reason, albeit on formal grounds, to classify it as a super western. Yet, High Noon and Shane remain two films that best illustrate the mutation of the western genre as an effect of the awareness it has gained of itself and its limits. In the former, Fred Zinman combines the effect of moral drama with the aestheticism of his framing. I am not one of those who turn up their noses at High Noon. I consider it a fine film and prefer it to Stevens' film. But the great skill exemplified in Foreman's adaptation was his ability to combine a story that might well have been developed in another genre with a traditional Western theme. In other words, he treated the Western as a form in need of a content. As for Shane, this is the ultimate in, quote, super Westernization, end quote. In fact, with it, George Stevens set out to justify the Western by the Western. The others do their ingenious best to extract explicit themes from implied myths, but the theme of Shane is the myth. In it, Stevens combines 2 or 3 basic Western themes, the chief being the knight-errant in search of his grail, and, so that no one will miss the point, Stevens dresses him in white. White clothes and a white horse are taken for granted in the Manichean world of the Western, but it is clear that the costume of Alan Ladd carries with it all the weighty significance of a symbol, while on Tom Mix it was simply the uniform of goodness and daring. So we have come full circle. The earth is round. The super Western has gone so far beyond itself as to find itself back in the Rocky Mountains. If the Western was about to disappear, the super Western would be the perfect expression of its decadence, of its final collapse. But the Western is definitely made of quite other stuff than the American comedy or the crime film. Its ups and downs do not affect its existence very much. Its roots continue to spread under the Hollywood humus, and one is amazed to see green and robust suckers spring up in the midst of the seductive but sterile hybrids that some would replace them by. To begin with, the appearance of the super western has only affected the more out of the ordinary productions, those of the A film and of the super production. These surface tremors have not disturbed the commercial nucleus, the central block of the ultra-commercial westerns, horseback or musical, which may even have found a second youth on television. The success of Hopalong Cassidy is a witness to this and proves likewise the vitality of the myth even in its most elementary form. Their acceptance by the new generation guarantees them several more cycles of years to come. But low-budget westerns never came to France, and we have to be satisfied with an assurance of their survival from the personnel of American distribution companies. If their aesthetic interest individually is limited, their existence, on the other hand, is probably decisive for the general health of the genre. It is in these, quote, lower, end quote, layers whose economic fertility has not diminished the traditional, quote, Western has continued to take root. Has not diminished that the traditional Western has continued to take root. Super Western or no Super Western, we are never without the B Western that does not attempt to find refuge in intellectual or aesthetic alibis. Indeed, maybe the notion of the B film is open to dispute, since everything depends on how far up the scale you put the letter A. The productions I am talking about are frankly commercial, probably fairly costly, relying for their acceptance only on the reputation of their leading man and a solid story without any intellectual ambitions. The Gunfighter, directed by Henry King, 1950, and starring Gregory Peck, is a splendid example of this attractive type of production in which the classic theme of the killer, sick of being on the run and yet forced to kill again, is handled within a dramatic framework with great restraint. We may mention too Across the Wide Missouri, directed by William Wellman, 1951, starring Clark Gable, and particularly Westward the Women, 1951, by the same director. The Rio Grande, 1951, John Ford himself has clearly returned to the semi-serial format, or at any rate to the commercial tradition, romance and all. So it is no surprise to find on the list an elderly survivor from the pioneer days of old, Alan Dwan, who for his part has never forsaken the old triangle. Note, in amalgamation of three American film production companies, Keystone, KB, and Fine Arts, Style, or end of note, Style, even when the liquidation of McCarthyism gave him the chance to broaden the scope of the old-time themes. Silverlode, 1954. I have still a few more points to make. The clarification I have followed up to now will turn out to be inadequate, and I must no longer explain the evolution of the Western genre by the Western genre itself. Instead, I must take the authors into greater account as a determining factor. It will doubtless have been observed that the list of relatively traditional productions that have been little influenced by the super western includes only names of established directors who even before the war specialized in fast-moving adventure films. It should come as no surprise that their work affirms the durability of the western and its laws. Howard Hawks, indeed, at the height of the vogue of the super western, should be credited with having demonstrated that it had always been possible to turn out a genuine western based on the old dramatic and spectacle themes without distracting our attention with some social thesis or what would amount to the same thing by the form given the production. Red River 1948 and The Big Sky 1952 are Western masterpieces, but there is nothing Baroque or decadent about them. The understanding and awareness of the means matches perfectly the sincerity of the story. The same goes for Raoul Walsh, all due allowances being made, whose film Saskatchewan 1954 is a classical example of a borrowing from American history, but his other films provide me, and I am sorry if it is a little contrived, with the transition I was looking for. Colorado Territory 1949, Pursued 1947, and Along the Great Divide 1951 are, in a sense, perfect examples of westerns just above the B level, made in a pleasantly traditional dramatic vein. Certainly there is no trace of a thesis. We are interested in the characters because of what happens to them, and nothing happens that is not in perfect accord with the Western theme. But there is something about them that, if we had no information about their date, would make us place them at once among more recent productions, and it is this, quote, something, end quote, that I would like to define. I have hesitated a great deal over what adjective best applies to these westerns of the 50s. At first, I thought I ought to turn to words like, quote, feeling, end quote, quote, sensibility, end quote, quote, lyricism, end quote. In any case, I think that these words must not be dismissed, and that they describe pretty well the character of the modern Western as compared with the super Western, which is almost always intellectual, at least to the degree that it requires the spectator to reflect before he can admire. All the titles I am about to list belong to films that are, if not less intelligent than High Noon, at least without arrière-pensée, and in which talent is always a servant of history and not of the meaning behind history. There is another word, maybe more suitable than those I have suggested, or which provides a useful complement, the word, quote, sincerity, end quote. I mean by this that the directors play fair with the genre even when they are conscious of, quote, making a Western, end quote. At the stage to which we have come in the history of the cinema, naivete is hardly conceivable, but although the super Western replaces naivete By preciousness or cynicism, we have proof that it is still possible to be sincere. Nicholas Ray shooting Johnny Guitar 1954 to the undying fame of Joan Crawford obviously knows what he is about. He is no less aware of the rhetoric of the genre than the George Stevens of Shane, and furthermore, the script and the director are not without their humor, but not once does Ray adopt a condescending or paternalist attitude toward his film. He may have fun with it, but he is not making fun of it. He does not feel restricted in what he has to say by the limits of the Western, even if what he has to say is decidedly more personal and more subtle than its unchanging mythology. It is with an eye on the style of the narrative rather than on the subjective attitude of the director to the genre that I will finally choose my epithet. I say freely of the Westerns I have yet to name, the best in my view, that they are, quote, novelistic, end quote. By this I mean that without departing from the traditional themes, they enrich them from within by the originality of their characters, their psychological flavor, and engaging individuality, which is what we expect from the hero of a novel. Clearly, when one talks about the psychological richness of Stagecoach, one is talking about the way it is used and not about any particular character. For the latter, we remain within the established casting categories of the Western: the banker, the narrow-minded woman, the prostitute with a heart of gold, the elegant gambler, and so on. In Run for Cover 1955, it is something else again. The situation and characters are still just variations on the tradition, but what attracts our interest is their uniqueness rather than their generosity. We know also that Nicholas Ray always treats his pet subject, namely the violence and mystery of adolescence. The best example of this, quote, novelization, end quote, of the Western from within is provided by Edward Dmytryk in Broken Lance, 1954, which we know is only a Western remake of Makowitz's House of Strangers. For the uninformed, Broken Lance is simply a Western that is subtler than the others, with more individualized characters and more complex relationships, but which stays no less rigidly within the limits of 2 or 3 classic themes. In point of fact, Elia Kazan has treated a psychologically somewhat similar subject with great simplicity in his Sea of Grass, 1947, also with Spencer Tracy. We can imagine many intermediate grades between the most dutiful B-Western and the novelistic Western, and my classification is inevitably arbitrary. Nevertheless, I offer the following idea. Just as Walsh is the most remarkable of the traditional veterans, Anthony Mann could be considered the most classical of the young novelistic directors. We owe the most beautifully true Western of recent years to him. Indeed, the author of The Naked Spur is probably the one post-war American director who seems to have specialized in a field into which others made only sporadic incursions. In any case, each of Mann's films reveals a touching frankness of attitude toward the Western, an effortless sincerity to get inside its themes and there bring to life appealing characters and to invent captivating situations. Anyone who wants to know what a real Western is and the qualities it presupposes in a director has to have seen Devil's Doorway, 1950, with Robert Taylor, Bend of the River, 1952, and The Far Country, 1954, with James Stewart. Even if he does not know these three films, he simply has to know the finest of all, The Naked Spur, 1953. Let us hope that CinemaScope will not rob Anthony Mann of his natural gift for direct and discreet use of the lyrical and, above all, his infallible sureness of touch in bringing together man and nature. That feeling of the open air, which in his films seems to be the very soul of the Western, and as a result of which he has recaptured, but at the level of the hero of the novel and no longer of the hero of the myth. The great lost secret of the Triangle Days. The above examples show that a new style and a new generation have come into existence simultaneously. It would be both going too far and naive to pretend that the novelistic Western is just something created by young men who came to filmmaking after the war. You could rightly refute this by pointing out that this quality is evident in the Westerner, for example, and there is something of it in Red River and The Big Sky. People assure me, although I am personally not aware of it, that there is much of it in Fritz Lang's Rancho Notorious, 1952. At all events, it is certain that King Vidor's excellent Man Without a Star, 1954, is to be placed in the same perspective, somewhere between Nicholas Ray and Anthony Mann. But we can certainly find 3 or 4 films made by the veterans to place alongside those that the younger men have made. In spite of everything, it is chiefly the newcomers who delight in the Western that is both classic and novelistic. Robert Aldrich is the most recent and brilliant example of this with his Apache, 1954, and especially his Vera Cruz, 1954. There remains now the problem of CinemaScope. This process was used for Broken Lance, Garden of Evil, 1954, by Henry Hathaway, a good script at once classic and novelistic, but treated without great inventiveness, and The Kentuckian, 1955, with Burt Lancaster, which bore the Venice Festival to tears. I only know one film in CinemaScope that added anything of importance to the mise-en-scène, namely Otto Preminger's River of No Return, 1954, photographed by Joseph Lichel. Yet, how often have we not read or have even ourselves written that while enlarging of the screen is not called for elsewhere, the new format will renew the westerns whose wide open spaces and hard writing call out for wide horizons. This deduction is too pat and likely sounding to be true. The most convincing example of the use of CinemaScope have been in psychological films, such as East of Eden. I would not go so far as to say that paradoxically the widescreen is unsuitable for westerns or that it adds nothing to them, but it seems to me already an accepted fact that CinemaScope will add nothing decisive to this field. Note: we have a reassuring example of this in The Man from Laramie, 1955, in which Anthony Mann does not use CinemaScope as a new format, but as an extension of the space around man. End of note. The Western, whether in its standard proportions in VistaVision or on a super wide screen, will remain the Western we hope our grandchildren will still be allowed to know. And I was reading The Evolution of the Western in What is Cinema by What is Cinema Volume 2 by Bazin.